there is a file. It belongs to a Chinese hydrologist named Chen Xing, and for most of his working life, it was kept open by people who did not want what it said to be true. In August of 1975, a storm crossed into central China and did not leave for 5 days. By the time it ended, one of the largest peacetime catastrophes of the 20th century had already happened in the dark, and it would take the rest of the world decades to learn most of what the survivors already knew. Chen had spent years warning that this was possible. He was not an outsider. He was not a rumor. He was a senior government engineer, and he had spent much of his career saying that storage without drainage was not safety. He had been demoted for saying it. He had been labeled a class enemy for saying it. And on the night the warning came true, he was hundreds of kilometers away, still under the label. When the water came, the official story would have room for the storm, the rescue, and the heroism of flood fighting. It had much less room for the engineer who had been punished for seeing the weakness early. That is why the shape of the story matters. A storm is easy to remember. A chain of design assumptions is harder. A punished warning is harder still, because it asks who was allowed to speak before the rain made the answer obvious. This is the story of how a warning became evidence only after it was too late, and how a disaster large enough to reshape a province still slipped out of public memory for decades. The dam at the center of the story was called Banqiao. It stood on the Ru River in Henan province, part of the larger Huai River system, and it belonged to a national effort that began after the Great Huai Flood of 1950. The new government promised to harness the river. That meant reservoirs, embankments, diversion areas, channels, work crews, slogans, and a whole generation of officials who were told that water could be disciplined if enough concrete and earth were moved into place. For the people building the system, this was not only engineering, it was a political claim about the future. Floods had been symbols of disorder, rural suffering, and state weakness. A reservoir could be pointed to as evidence that the new order had learned to command what older governments could only endure. That made the projects emotionally and politically powerful before their hydrology had been fully tested. Banqiao began construction in 1951. Its first version was completed in 1952. In the middle of the decade, Banqiao and the nearby Shimantan Dam were reinforced and expanded with Soviet technical influence. On paper, this was not a crude local wall. It was part of a serious flood control program, built inside the confidence of a new state that wanted disasters to become manageable. Then the Great Leap Forward changed the pace and the politics of that confidence. Between 1957 and 1959, more than 100 dams and reservoirs were built in Jumadian prefecture alone. The governing idea in Henan was often summarized as giving primacy to storage: store water, hold water, turn floodwater into irrigation water, make reservoirs the proof that the province was advancing. The phrase sounds practical until you ask what it leaves out. Storage is visible. Drainage is humble. Storage creates a lake that can be counted, photographed, and praised. Drainage creates capacity that may only prove itself by preventing a scene no one sees. In a political campaign built around production targets and visible achievements, the visible solution had an advantage before the technical argument even began. Chen Xing saw the problem in that phrase. He was a senior technical figure inside Henan Water Conservancy, trained as a water engineer and trusted enough to work on major projects. His warning was not that reservoirs were useless. It was that central plain hydrology could not be forced into a storage-first dream. Flat land drains slowly. Water tables rise. Fields become waterlogged. Salt and alkali move into the soil. A system that holds water without enough release capacity can make the next flood worse. In later Chinese source chains, Chen's warning is compressed into three plain words: flood, waterlogging, and salinization. That was not a cinematic prophecy. It was a technical objection to a development line, and that made it politically dangerous. Drainage does not photograph like a dam. An emergency channel does not look as heroic as a reservoir wall. Safety margins do not produce the same visible promise as a lake held behind earth and concrete. Chen's argument asked officials to spend political energy on the boring parts of flood control, the parts that only look brilliant after they save people. In 1958, that kind of caution could be recoded as disloyalty. Chen was labeled a right-wing opportunist and sent away to Xinjiang. The system did not lose him because it had no engineers. It pushed him aside because his engineering challenged the doctrine. That is the first important turn. Banqiao was not built by people who thought floods were harmless. It was built inside a system that trusted storage, distrusted descent, and began treating the people who asked about failure as the problem. The easy version of the story says Chen predicted one dam would fail, one warning was ignored, and one disaster followed. The better record is more precise and more disturbing. Chen was arguing against a way of making decisions. He believed Henan's plain reservoirs were being judged by how much water they could hold, while the system paid too little attention to how water would move when the holding failed. His warning was not magic. It was basin logic. The most memorable example does not belong cleanly to Banqiao. It belongs to another reservoir, Suya Lake. Chen Xing's broader flood safety disputes with Henan's storage-first leadership included the reduction of sluice capacity on his Suya Lake reservoir design from 12 gates to 5, alongside similar reductions in regional flood diversion infrastructure. The political pressure that produced these reductions also shaped how dams across the Huai Basin were built in the years before 1975. That wording matters. Suya Lake was not Banqiao. Bantai was not Shimantan. These names cannot be collapsed into one dramatic object without breaking the truth of the case. But the examples show the same pressure moving through the same flood control world. At Bantai, a flood diversion sluice on the Henan-Anhui border was reduced from an original 9 gates to 7, and 2 of those were later blocked. Again, the point is not that each structure changed in the same way. The point is that Chen had been warning about a structural habit. Storage was celebrated, release capacity was treated as negotiable, and technical caution could be made to look politically suspect. This is where the word prediction can mislead. Chen was not predicting the exact hour of a future breach from a single document. He was identifying the kind of landscape that would turn one failure into many. He was saying that the plains needed exits as much as reservoirs. He was saying that water held in the wrong place becomes water waiting for the wrong day. According to Yi Si's account, the system returned to Chen in 1961, after Great Leap water problems had become harder to deny. Liu Jianshun, a Henan party secretary, searched for people who had opposed the bad policy line and found Chen in Xinjiang. The episode is vivid, but it should be handled as Yi Si's account, not as omniscient drama. Even so, the pattern is clear enough. The same official world that had punished a hydrologist for dissent later needed his hydrology. The warning did not end there. A later speech by Qian Zhengying, the Minister of Water Resources and Electric Power, described a reassessment after a severe rainstorm in 1972. The system had reasons to examine Banqiao's safety before 1975. The needed measures, she said, were not adopted. That detail keeps the story from becoming a simple morality play about the 1950s. The warning did not freeze in one old political campaign. Severe rain kept returning. Technical reassessment kept becoming possible. Yet the gap between recognition and action stayed open. So when the storm arrived, it did not strike a blank page. It struck a basin where the argument had already been made, where release and drainage had already been contested, where emergency planning had not caught up to the risk, and where the most useful kind of doubt had spent years being treated as a political defect. That is what Chen actually predicted. Not one cinematic minute of collapse. A flood control system that had made itself fragile in the exact places where it believed it was strongest. In early August 1975, Typhoon Nina moved inland and met other weather systems over Henan. The storm stalled. The rain did not behave like the design tables had taught local officials to expect. Yixi's account gives the first major deluge on August 5th as 448.1 millimeters. Banqiao rose close to its maximum capacity. Sluice gates were opened, but the system was already slow to drain, and the storm was not finished. Inside the worst pocket of the storm, 830 millimeters of rain fell in 6 hours. Over 5 days, the broader event zone took in more than 1,600 millimeters. Those numbers protect the story from a false simplicity. This was not an ordinary rainstorm being exaggerated after the fact. It was an extreme event at the edge of what any local design table had been built to imagine. The sequence also mattered. Yixi describes a second deluge beginning around noon on August 7th, then a third beginning around 4 p.m. and lasting for about 13 hours. Water that might have been survivable as one peak became a repeated pressure test. Reservoirs that had been high became critical. Areas already cut off became harder to reach. Each hour reduced the number of options available to people who still did not know where the worst failure would come from. But extreme rain only explains the trigger. It does not explain why the flood control system behaved as if large dam failure were still outside the imagination. By August 7th, roads and telephones were failing. Water was entering management areas. Repair crews and local residents worked around the Banqiao embankment through the dark in rising water, with less information than they needed. Chen Xing was not there. He was in Xinjiang, away from the dam that would soon make his old argument unavoidable. At 7 o'clock that evening, according to Yixi, the Jumadian Municipal Revolutionary Committee met to assess danger to several dams. Banqiao was not treated as the central danger. It was regarded as an iron dam. The phrase is important because it shows the gap between confidence and preparation. A dam can be called iron in a meeting and still be earth in the rain. By 9 p.m., 7 smaller dams in places such as Queshan and Biyang had already failed. An hour later, the medium-sized Zhugu Dam followed. The chain was beginning before the famous collapse. The local system was already sending out its evidence, one failed structure at a time. Those earlier failures are easy to skip because they are not the name in the title, but they are the warning signal inside the event itself. If a regional flood control network is losing smaller dams before midnight, then the question is no longer whether one reservoir is heroic enough to stand. The question is whether the people managing the system can still see the system at all. The 1972 reassessment that had recommended measures not taken was now no longer a document problem. It was an operational problem. Communications were breaking. Access was breaking. Smaller reservoirs were breaking. And the committee rooms, the slogans, the design assumptions, the emergency plans, and the faith in storage were all being tested at once. By the late hours of August 7th, the field lines along the upstream embankments were going down one by one. Power was failing. Roads were broken. The duty crews at the major reservoirs were running out of ways to ask for help and ways to receive instructions. Whatever else was true about what was about to happen, no one inside the basin was going to find out about it in time to warn anyone outside it. The storm had become a countdown, but the countdown was broader than the failure of one dam. It was to the moment when the basin would reveal how many separate things had been, depending on the same wrong confidence. The exact order of the two major failures is not perfectly settled. Some source chains place Shimantan first. Others center Banqiao and say Shimantan followed soon after. The safest way to say it is that both major dams failed in the early morning window between roughly midnight and 2 a.m. on August 8th, with Banqiao giving way shortly after 1 o'clock. That small uncertainty does not weaken the story. It makes the story more honest. The record is clear on the larger fact. Once the major dams failed, the disaster was no longer a single breach. It became a moving system failure. Yisi describes roughly 600 million cubic meters of water surging out from Banqiao. Shimantan added its own release in the same window. The wave from Banqiao has been described as several meters high and as wide as many kilometers across the plain. It did not move like a river in its channel. It moved like the channel had disappeared. A warning that arrives at the same time as the flood is not a warning. It is only noise inside the disaster. And the disagreement over exact timing is part of that same darkness. In a controlled test, engineers can mark a failure by the second. In Henan that night, power was failing, roads were broken, telephones were gone, and separate dams were entering crisis inside the same storm window. Later accounts tried to order the facts from fragments. That is why the script has to leave the sequence bounded instead of pretending the archive gives a perfect clock. By the time daylight began to define the landscape, the familiar shorthand was already forming. 62 dams collapsed. That number can sound almost abstract. 62 is easy to repeat and hard to picture. But what it means is that failure moved through a whole reservoir landscape, hitting downstream structures and flood diversion areas that were not ready to absorb what was arriving from above. Nihua and Laowangpo, the flood diversion zones that were supposed to help control the release, could not take the volume. Dikes failed. Water pooled where it should have passed through. A vast, temporary inland lake formed across the region, cutting off counties, rail lines, villages, and roads from one another. The damage map widened quickly. Later summaries speak of more than 10 million people affected. Millions of houses collapsed. Farmland flooded across a huge area, and sections of the Beijing-Guangzhou Railway destroyed. These scale facts explain why the first wave could not be separated from the weeks that followed. Once roads, rail, houses, fields, and local communications were gone, rescue itself became a second engineering problem. This is why Banqiao cannot be understood as a simple duel between a dam and a storm. The storm supplied the force. The basin supplied the chain. The wave reached places whose residents had no meaningful way to read the upstream engineering story. Wencheng Commune became one of the names that later accounts would return to, because there the scale became local. It was not yet a death toll argument. It was water in the dark, moving into homes, onto roofs, through fields, and across the routes people would have used to escape. The duty crews could no longer solve the problem at the crest. The field telephones that might have carried warning had already failed or become useless. The people below the dams were not facing one known wall of water from one known place. They were facing a flood control system that had stopped behaving as a system. At dawn, the engineering question changed. It was no longer whether Banqiao could be saved. It was how many communities below it could still be reached. And that is where the disaster became larger than the breach. The water did not become less deadly when it stopped moving fast. For many people downstream, the disaster entered its second phase when the floodplain became an inland lake. Roads were gone. Railway sections were destroyed. Villages became islands. People survived the first night and then found themselves trapped in heat, mud, contaminated water, and the bodies of animals and people that could not be buried quickly enough. Yisi's account preserves telephone record-style reports from the days after the collapse. On August 13th, 1 million people were still trapped in water east of Xinkai and Pingyu. By August 17th, about 1.1 million were still trapped, and sickness was spreading. On August 18th, the reports listed dysentery, typhoid, hepatitis, influenza, malaria, and enteritis across affected counties. The catastrophe had become medical, logistical, and administrative. It was no longer only a question of who had been caught by the wave. It was a question of who could be reached before heat, hunger, polluted water, and untreated wounds did the rest. On August 21st, food was being dropped from the air, but accounts say much of it landed in contaminated water. A sack of grain could arrive and still be almost unusable. Relief existed, but access had become part of the disaster. This is where ordinary rescue language breaks down. To say that food was dropped is true. To say that aid was mobilized is true. But a disaster zone can receive effort and still remain lethal if the effort cannot reach bodies cleanly, in time, and in usable form. The question after Banqiao was not simply whether the state responded. It was whether the system it had built left survivors reachable after the response began. This is the part of Banqiao that makes the numbers split. Estimates range from about 26,000 immediate flood deaths to about 230,000 total deaths, once disease and famine in the aftermath are included. Both figures appear in serious sources. They are not contradictory. They count different things. That distinction is not a technical footnote. It is the difference between counting only the people killed by the first wall of water and counting the people who died because the flood control system also failed to leave behind a reachable, livable landscape. Wencheng Commune makes the abstraction harder to escape. Yisi's account says it lost roughly half its residents. In one brigade, the reported loss was 1,000 out of 1,700. That is a community where, by the time the inland lake was mapped, More children, parents, neighbors, and elders were missing than remained. Whole rows of houses sat empty above the waterline. Whole memories of who had lived in a courtyard last week became calculations about who could still be found. Chen Xing's old warning about plains, drainage, waterlogging, and flood aftermath now had human form. Storage had failed first as engineering, then drainage failed as survival. The official narrow number did not count the whole shape of that survival failure. The broader number tried to include it. Between them sits the real argument over Banqiao, not how many people the flood killed in a single hour, but how much of the disaster a state is willing to name when the deadliest part came after the water. That distinction is the final pressure on the record. After the flood, Chen Xing came back into the story in the only way this system could allow him back in, as a useful expert, not as a public indictment. Yi Si's account records that on August 12th, senior officials inspected the devastated area from the air, and that Chen was with them. The same account records that Liu Jianxun sought Chen out and asked him to go to Beijing to request permission to dynamite structures that were holding back trapped floodwater. That episode relies heavily on Yi Si's account, so it should not be treated as a clean cinematic climax. But it is a powerful document of reversal. The official world that had punished Chen's kind of warning now needed Chen's kind of knowledge. Dynamiting did happen. Some trapped water was released. Some people were saved by later actions that should not be erased from the story. The problem is that rescue after collapse is not the same as readiness before collapse. In November 1975, Chen Zhengying spoke at a national conference on dam and reservoir safety. Her speech, preserved in later accounts, did not simply blame rain. It named failures in standards, reservoir management, communications, emergency procedures, materials, equipment, and leadership lines. That matters because it shows the system could criticize parts of itself after catastrophe. But the deeper political sentence was harder to say. It was easier to admit that communications were weak than to admit why warnings had been politically dangerous. It was easier to improve reservoir standards than to tell the public how a senior hydrologist had been branded unreliable for challenging the doctrine beneath those standards. It was easier to describe management failures than to explain why technical dissent had been treated as a threat. The system punished the people who warned about the risks and failed to prepare for a large dam collapse. That is not the same as saying the flood was planned, or that anyone wanted the deaths that followed. The record does not support that. The harder truth is colder. Institutions can create conditions for disaster without needing to desire the disaster itself. Chen's partial return did not give him a clean public victory. Banqiao proved his warning, but the proof came in the form of flooded counties, disease reports, and names that had to be reconstructed through later books and documents. The dissenter was needed. His whole truth was not. The public record after Banqiao did not close all at once. It opened in stages, and those stages matter. In 1975, contemporary coverage in Henan emphasized heroic flood fighting, while the Banqiao Shimantan catastrophe itself remained largely absent from public view. That omission was part of the memory problem. The disaster had happened. Rescue had happened. Officials had investigated. But the event did not become public knowledge in proportion to its scale. In March 1979, the Huai River Water Resources Committee reportedly produced an internal investigation report on the August 1975 rainstorms and flooding. Human Rights Watch could later identify the title of that report, but not locate a public copy. That absence is its own kind of evidence. It shows that a formal technical record existed, while ordinary public access did not. That distinction matters, because secrecy is often imagined as a locked room with nothing inside. Banqiao's memory problem was stranger. The system did know things. It investigated. It circulated figures in limited places. It allowed some technical lessons to move through official channels. What it did not do was make the whole shape of the catastrophe publicly available in a way proportionate to the loss. In the late 1980s, partial figures and fragments began appearing in limited Chinese publications. One ministry-linked flood history volume in 1989 reportedly used a figure of 85,600 dead. A later volume revised the line to 26,000 drowned and called the earlier figure an error, without giving a full public explanation that settled the larger question. Then came the outside circulation milestone that many later retellings flatten into the wrong date. 1995 widened outside circulation when Human Rights Watch published its appendix. 2005 marked the key public opening step in Chinese official treatment of disaster death secrecy, with Xinhua's public retrospective appearing on November 26, 2005. Between those two dates, Yi Si's 1998 chapter in Dai Qing's volume made the disaster more legible to English-reading audiences and preserved details that official summaries did not carry with the same force. Zhang Guangyu and other later witnesses helped describe the fear and silence around expert speech during the disaster period. So Banqiao was not simply hidden until one heroic reveal. The record widened unevenly. Internal report, limited circulation, outside human rights appendix, anti-dam memory work, official secrecy change, public retrospective. That uneven record also protects the story from a cheap conspiracy frame. There were reporters, engineers, officials, critics, and later researchers trying to preserve pieces of the truth. The issue is that the pieces moved through a system that controlled their reach. Some facts were allowed to be technical. Some were allowed to be historical. Fewer were allowed to become a public moral account. That uneven widening is why the story still feels unstable. The disaster is famous enough now to have encyclopedia entries and YouTube clones. But the central questions still depend on which document you are reading, which number it counts, which source chain it trusts, and what political purpose the memory served at the time. The first failure was water management. The second was truth management. By the time the record had widened far enough to name what had happened in proportion to the loss, almost everyone the warning had been intended to save was already gone. That uncomfortable fact did not stay buried inside Banqiao alone. Years later, when China debated larger dam projects, especially Three Gorges, Banqiao returned as a warning reference. The danger in that kind of comparison is that it sounds strong while becoming technically careless. The honest connection is different. Banqiao became an institutional and political warning reference in the debate over later Chinese megadam projects. The connection is one of memory and political argument, not of direct engineering equivalence. Three Gorges is not Banqiao. It sits on a different river. It is a different kind of structure. And it was built under different standards by a different generation of engineers who had been trained on the Banqiao lesson. That is why Yixi's Banqiao chapter appeared inside a Three Gorges critical volume. It carried a disaster story into an argument about what happens when large water projects become prestige projects, when technical criticism is politically inconvenient, and when official memory narrows the cost after the fact. Human Rights Watch used Banqiao and Shimantan as a cautionary appendix in its Three Gorges report for similar reasons. The appendix was not a dam breach prediction. It was a record of secrecy, displacement, technical dissent, and what can happen when a state treats scale as its own proof of safety. Li Rui and other critics of grand storage projects made a related point. Long-term flood protection could not be reduced to reservoir capacity and official confidence. Rivers have geography. Plains have drainage limits. Communities below the structures live with the consequences when the boring questions are treated as disloyal. The relevance was not that Banqiao supplied a ready-made verdict on every later dam. It was that Banqiao showed how memory can be managed after failure, and how managed memory can make future debate less honest. If the public record narrows what happened, then the next argument begins with a smaller warning than history actually provided. This is where Chen Xing's warning outlived the official comfort zone around him. The system could rehabilitate parts of his technical argument. It could rebuild Banqiao. It could revise standards. It could publish a retrospective 30 years later. But the deeper memory problem kept returning, because Chen's case was never only about whether one dam held during one storm. It was about who gets heard before the storm. That is why Banqiao remained useful to critics long after the floodplain dried. A system can learn the engineering lesson and still resist the honesty lesson, because engineering can be revised in manuals. Honesty has to be revised in power. Chen Xing lived long enough to see the disaster discussed more openly than it had been in 1975. In 2009, the year he died, a book under his name appeared, roughly rendered in English as Water Control Has No End. That title is a quiet way to leave the story. Water control has no end because rivers keep moving, storms keep exceeding the old tables, and planes keep reminding engineers that storage is never the same thing as safety. But Banqiao also showed another kind of work with no clean ending, the work of telling the truth about a system after the system has already paid for its mistake with other people's lives. The rebuilt Banqiao could be inspected. New standards could be written. Emergency planning could be improved. The structure itself could stand as evidence of that narrower learning. Those lessons fit inside the ordinary language of engineering repair. The other lesson does not fit so neatly. It asks why the useful warning became politically expensive before the disaster and administratively inconvenient after it. Banqiao became a mass death disaster, not because one storm was unimaginable, but because a flood control system punished the engineer who understood its weakest assumption, and then buried what his vindication cost. That is why Chen matters. One man could not have stopped the rain. His biography does not contain every later decision. What it does contain is the mechanism made readable: storage over drainage, confidence over preparation, political loyalty over technical doubt. Then, after the water, public memory over public accounting. Chen Xing's file, the one the system kept open on him for most of his working life, is still in there somewhere. So is his 2009 book. It is a small object. It does not have a large readership. It is, in its way, the conscience the system could delay, but could not erase. He died on May 15th, 2009. The book remained. The documents remained. The numbers remained unsettled in exactly the way the disaster had made them unsettled. Banqiao taught an engineering lesson quickly. It taught the lesson about truth much more slowly.